Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the cafe today. My name is Stacy. I'm with the South Dakota Humanities Council, and we are going to talk about Indigenous art today. My original panel was supposed to be 4 people, and I'm still waiting on 3. I don't know if we're having technical difficulties or anything like that, but I have with me Keith Braveheart, and so we're good. We're going ahead. It's tourist and travel season, and so as people are traveling, they're visiting museums and other venues across South Dakota, and undoubtedly you'll come across a number of phenomenal works created by Native American artists, right? But interestingly, there is no word for art in the Lakota language, and the works created are not simply what I would say art for art's sake. They have a purpose and a power of their own. So helping us to understand the power purpose of that art, right for just for the moment, is Keith Braveheart. Keith, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and tell us what you do and where you are, and then we'll unpack things a little bit.
Sure. Well, thank you everybody for your time today. I really do appreciate that. And I'm also very thankful to be here, to be invited, first of all, by Stacy. I'm here on, I guess, multiple behalves. I'm here, first of all, on behalf of my position as a program manager at the Oglala Lakota Art Space, which is located on our Pine Ridge Reservation, services our Oglala Sioux tribe, which I am a citizen of. And so our Oglala Lakota Art Space is located centrally in our reservation land, which is Western South Dakota, for those who might not be familiar with the landscape. And so I'm here to help promote the work that we're doing there at the Oglala Lakota Art Space and how it supports overall humanities and enrichment of just lifestyle for our relatives, is what we say. That's a philosophy of recognizing others as that close, like kinship. But we just have uphold a kind of respectful approach and responsibility to making sure that everybody has a welcoming kind of comfort, and also know that they have a belonging as well too. And then secondarily, I'm here on behalf of myself. I am a contemporary Lakota artist, is how I identify myself. I'm primarily a visual artist, so I work within visual media. But my heart, and this is what I always tell everybody, is that my heart is really in painting. So that's what I love to do most of all. But I also work with community engaged art practices, and I help to support our community engaged arts initiatives, not only here in our homelands, which I will refer to as the state of South Dakota, but really beyond, even into the Northern Plains territories that are our traditional homelands of the Confederacy of Ochete Shakowin peoples, which include the expansive other nations that are sometimes identified as the Sioux people. And so a lot of my work is dedicated to really the cultural enrichments and continuums of making sure that our creative lifestyles and just overall well-being maintains into the future. And I'm also an arts educator. I work pretty extensively with a lot of different supports and different kind of platforms, but I've recently resigned from a position I held for our tribal college as an arts professor for 7 years. And I'm also, I don't like to really kind of try to make it seem like I'm rolling out my resume too heavily, but I am one of 2 inaugural artist laureates for our tribe as well too, the Oglala Sioux tribe. So I'll turn it back to you, Stacy.
It's safe to say that you're a very, very busy guy. But I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you for sharing your knowledge and your time and stuff, and keeping the importance of Indigenous art alive and going for future generations. So I guess the biggest thing right off the top is I was surprised to learn there is no word for art in the Lakota language, but I know that Lakota is a visual language. We had exhibition come through that from the Smithsonian last year or the year before, that we needed translated into Lakota. And the three individuals that were translating it, there was a word that there wasn't a Lakota word for. And so they had to create a word, and all three of them came up with a different word. So I think that it's kind of, then it put in that context, it makes sense that there's no word for art, because what is art to Native American peoples? What is it that sets it apart from what we, Western civilization would call art?
Sure. Well, I guess to begin, we do have to recognize that the concept of art that we spell with a capital A,
Mhm.
RT, really is a Western construct. Comes from a Eurocentric lineage, and that's great. We do appreciate that. I know that today, especially within these modern era, we really recognize that we want to utilize some of the ways that art has manifested through that kind of lineage. But when it comes to the authenticity of viewpoint, when it's an indigenous perspective, and even more specifically Lakota, maybe art and how we can start to consider this is something that relates more to, I guess, of practicality, utilitarian needs. But I think it's also just simply going back to the humanities of just individual's purpose. What is it to express yourself? And then what does it mean then to express yourself in relation to the world that surrounds you? And we can think about socially, how is it that what you're making then has an impact on people around you, either your family or your society, or even bigger than that. It could be the concept again of relative making, where the Lakota people, where a relative could also be non-human. What is it that you're making that might have some sort of purpose for animal nations, such as the buffalo or horses or even eagles, maybe? But even beyond further than that, what would it be to have your work then be an expression or communication that transcends into the metaphysical, like having some sort of communication with the thunders, the winds, or even the galaxy, possibly? And so those kind of like thinking patterns are pretty abstract. They're very large. They're what we might call, kind of outside of logic, maybe, and how we think about things that are like brought back down to earth. But I think the people always have this kind of like sophisticated mindset where they can experience that they have this ability to interact with the world at a large, large scale.
Mm.
So I think that this does travel across the globe, and that many people would, have this type of moment where they would unlock the power of their brains, and it would be that creativity or art would become a vehicle for how they can then move into that type of like sensation experience, or even reality to themselves, maybe as well too. So when I first heard that phrase, because I remember hearing it early in my career too, that there is no Lakota word for art. And I really thought that that was pretty stoic sounding. And so I
Yeah.
always utilized that as part of my artist statement whenever I began to like try to explain my perspective of what it is that I'm doing in my path as a creative person. And I know that there are many words within the Lakota language that can describe, because that's again about the Lakota languages, it's very descriptive. It will help you
Mm.
by kind of painting a picture verbally of what it is that it's pertaining to. And so I know that there's words for like certain objects, the process of making those objects, but then it gets again a little bit deeper with the philosophical nature about the intention of what those processes or things are meant to be like servicing or providing or being like a aid to as well too.
Well, and I think too, when I think back to what you typically would see in any museum of any type of art, is that the historical piece of that. And so I think it's interesting that when I say art, indigenous art is not art for art's sake. It was had a purpose. It was created, like a piece of pottery was not created to be looked at. It was created to be used, right? And then there's the spirituality that is put into the creation of that piece. So um but it was all practical, right? It all had a practical use at some point, either communication or record keeping. Um, it is so, when used as a means of communication, like I'm specifically thinking of like winter counts. with, as a historical reference, I guess, how much did the artist's effectiveness or their ability to communicate effectively what they were trying to say um, depend on the recognition of or the influence of familiarity with tradition itself? Like, is that the only way to understand it is through the tradition and familiarity with that tradition?
Possibly, I think possibly, but I think another way to start to kind of begin to look at the ancestry or ancestral origins of indigenous art, but this can also be very much relevant to all art around the world from the beginning of time. And I think that it's just the expressive urgency that human beings had to say, like, this is who I am, or this is who we are, and this is also where we're at. And so they would leave a mark or some sort of like visual communication to kind of claim maybe some property or territory. And eventually, as the people kind of began to become more in tune with their surroundings, and maybe they felt like there was a stronger relationship that forced them to really kind of protect that area, they really did kind of become defensive and start to really say, like, beware, maybe through their markings that were visual first before the, I guess, development of written languages. And so a lot of those visuals were, I think, a lot more recognizable and almost like unanimously understood across barriers of languages, but even culture as well too. And so that's still with us today, the visual communication and how dynamic it is, because people are still kind of condensing their expression and their need to communicate into as little bit of possible of a visual that can then be interpreted through the eyes of the viewer, the reader. And so we see things like emojis, reactions, and all that today still being really like heavily utilized, especially by younger generations more and more. But I think for the indigenous peoples, they definitely held on to that a little bit longer, where they understood that the square that they were making symbolized the mountains, the hills, or a river, or whatever it was that became like really like particular to who they were, But some of these then became a little bit much more larger as like a circle. Okay, that's the sun, maybe, or maybe that's the direction of where the sun sets. And so the different tribes within the areas, as they were pretty much nomadic, tribal people all across the world were pretty nomadic at the beginning of time. And so they started to kind of become aware of each other. And I think that they kind of maybe felt like they needed to critique each other and say, I don't know if I agree with your interpretation. So I'm going to scratch that out and kind of like adjust it to my perspective. And I think with even those kind of mergings, we have new forms of visuals that then the next generation might adhere to and then really start to refer to as like, well, this is like older than me, therefore we need to respect it and then continue to like um, give some sort of reference to it or reverence to it too. And so I think over time, these have become, the traditional visuals that then are carried over and over without really any probably critical thinking about where they came from or how they originated. It's just that we can't question tradition, keep it going. But I know for the Lakota people, when it comes to certain designs that become much more complicated, um, the way that those come into an existence is through an individual's gift. It was a dream. It was gifted to this person through a different kind of experience where they then interpreted it publicly. And so people became aware, like, okay, well, that combination of triangles or that certain zigzag pattern, or especially colors as well, too, those represent that family as the clans grew bigger and bigger, and they started to really become more dominantly kind of structured as families that were the big amount of the people of the society. So I think that that's kind of like a little bit of a nutshell of indigenous art history when we're thinking about the beginnings of like just where we're talking about. Because then it would
So,
it would move on into then winter counts and then later to more of the drawing practice, which would be then the ledger drawing or ledger art.
so when you were talking about tradition and it dating back to, you know, a long, long time ago now, is it even possibly to, is it even possible to adequately trace the origins of Native American decorative design? I mean, the tradition brings it forward, but is it even possible to see how it all started? Like this, because I know I was speaking with Craig Howe about Lakota star knowledge and the map of the Black Hills with the, like you said, the squares, and like how is that just carried forward through oral tradition and written tradition, what those symbols mean? Or how is that deciphered, I guess would be the only word I can think of.
A good amount could be, I guess, um, it could be supported, it could be verified through oral tradition, and maybe how that is, I guess, given some sort of approval of like, where does the citations go back to, which family is telling these stories and how long, how many generations has it been told in their family lines. But I think that really tracing it exactly back to the first occurrence is maybe impossible at this point. There's just so much time that has passed. But I think some possibilities could be working with partners in the scientific field, where maybe they can kind of estimate how old certain landscapes are. Because many of these old visual communications were first recorded onto walls, dwelling spaces, or like more kind of like certain sites that became like stopping points within the migration patterns of the people. And so we have a lot of these, what they call petroglyphs, and they're all across our area. There's many out here in Western South Dakota in the canyons of the Black Hills. You can go up to Hot Springs if any of you have ever been out this way, and there's some that are still out that way. There's areas within the inside of the hills too. That will be the caves as you get deeper and deeper. That I'm sure there's even more ancient kind of visuals that are waiting to be discovered. There's some that are known, especially by the tribal people that might be in those positions where they have access to these, isolated locations. These would be considered like our tribal historic preservation officers, which are out there who are becoming aware that there's things like this still out there. And so some of them will bring that knowledge back to their tribal lands, and they'll communicate with their cultural um, elders or bearers that kind of share that knowledge, like these things are out there, and then they'll meet and they'll still conduct the way that they would kind of like try to approach this as a conversation through the I guess protocol maybe of making it part of like a prayer, like addressing that there are entities that are beyond the human that need to be acknowledged first, and asking for like some sort of approval to then look into it a little bit deeper. And so even in that, there could be more communication that occurs that's transcendent, and that could support, some ideas for our human comprehensions that let us know, like, okay, yeah, this is very ancient. This was from a certain time when maybe there was a prehistoric age where there were still dinosaurs on the earth. Or maybe it was later. Maybe it was later, right before the encounter with people from different continents. So what we think about is colonization in that era. Or even later, which is probably easier to identify, which has become like the reservation era. The switch between the old buffalo days into the reservation period now that we understand, and then into our modern history time. I think is even more easier.
Then that makes me think of something kind of tied to that. So that change in era from you know into the reservation era, was there a distinctly marked change in art in that time? Like in how things were depicted, and how what did that look like?
Definitely. I feel like that really does become the moment of how we think about contemporary art, because a lot of the work was depicting what was currently happening.
Mhm.
You'll see, these interactions with a lot of the time soldiers or whoever might be coming across the plains, and many of it, the times it was first those soldiers, and then even the then kind of pursuits that took place. Some of the ancient, we call them grandfathers, that were considered hostile. They refused to then kind of sign these peace treaties and then reside permanently on these reservation territories now, our boundaries. They were still being, holding on to as much as they could the freedom of living on the landscape, how they felt like naturally that was meant to be for them. But eventually, many of them were captured and then placed into these forts, these prisons. And so, one of the turning points that I always like to show is like in that moment of despair, being taken like drastically, switching your lifestyle day and night, and then being put in an isolation where you just feel like, well, what am I going to do? And then somehow, some way, there's a new alien objects that are presented to you, which are simply just paper and pencil. And then that freedom to escape that actual physical isolation and then express themselves through the drawing. That's all it was drawing, but then that becomes really one of the most renowned, prolific examples of what we now call like a lot of like plains art, even like I would say Native American art, which is the ledger art. Um, so I think that that really does show that there is something that could come through this duality of like negative and then positive as well. But since then, it's also nourished a market. It's really fueled a Native American, Indian, Native American, modern art market today still, where that becomes the most prized format of art that patrons, collectors, even museums seek out. They want something like that because they feel like the antiquity behind it is a verification of authenticity as well too. And so sometimes they
I,
even overlook like the expression which is placed onto the paper, which is even more authentic, I believe.
I think I read an article, and I think it was Harvard has a fully intact ledger book of ledger art, and that the rarity of that, the article I read was about the rarity that exists, that pages weren't torn out, because that was typical. They would tear, people would tear them out and say, oh, look at this, look at this. So what these pictographs, first of all, why is it called ledger art? I guess for anybody who doesn't know, why is it called ledger art?
Referencing the ledger book. And so I know we live in a digital age where most people probably don't utilize paper and pencil as much anymore. But in those historical times, you had to account for many different things. And so the way they did was writing it down into their ledger book. And so those were just, I think, on hand many of the times. And so I guess, settlers, the soldiers, whoever was coming across these Indian territories, they probably had them with them and they didn't think more of them, that they were very familiar with them. They were desensitized to what it was representing as just like a medium. And so they probably gave them away freely. And for the native peoples, that was their first time seeing such a thing. And so I think to them, they were captivated by it, where maybe they couldn't stop drawing in it once they got going. I always also kind of use the example of like looking back at a child. If any of you ever witness a child pick up pencils or markers or crayons and then discover for themselves what it's like to make a mark and to start to control what it is that their images are that they're creating, they really become at peace with it, right? Or they even become more like invested, like they're really deep in like that experience for themselves. So it's the same thing for those ancestors. A lot of them were older in age, so I think that maybe it was like a lightning strike kind of moment where it's just like amazing. And I think that it was something that really unleashed a deeper part of the memory as well too, because many of those images that we see weren't from trained artists in observational like methods of drawing. They didn't have something in front of them that they were kind of recreating. They were looking back into their youth, decades back,
Yeah.
and they were bringing out vivid detail in their drawings. You can see this in the way that they depicted horses, especially the most cherished, beloved horse that they had. You'll see the details really, really nicely. Or even themselves too. They can even have the scenes of like, very like pivotal moments in their life. Maybe this is the time when they made a song, a courting song where they actually attracted their, which would be wife, or a near death experience where they were in the heat of battle and they were victorious, they won, they escaped death. Things like that are really seen. But there's many others that would really move into the reservation era that become very important as well too, because there's no photographs of one of our legendary leaders, Crazy Horse, for the Oglala people, but there are ledger drawings that show of the way he adorned himself and the way he rode into battle at the Little Bighorn. There's also a scene done by a famous Oglala artist named Amos Badhart Bull, which shows the killing or assassination of Crazy Horse at Fort Robinson in Nebraska as well too. And so these are the images that are important to us. And with not having those vehicles of art and creativity or the medium that they were created with, we wouldn't be able to then carry on our history of those moments as well too.
Well, and it kind of goes back to, the what we were talking about. There's a purpose behind the art. It's not like you said, it's their favorite horse, or it tells a story, it depicts a certain event or something important. And so when I think of the ledger art that we're talking about now, and the other piece that comes to mind is the winter counts. Like when I was at recently, for everybody else on the call, I was recently at the National Museum of American Indian in Washington, D.C., and I got to see some just amazing artifacts. And I in talking with the one of the curators there, Paul Chott Smith, we talked a lot about with the depiction of things like that. And winter counts are probably, to most of America, what they think of when they think of American Indian art. It's most common. Um, I think N. Scott Momaday referred to winter counts as the link between oral and written tradition, just like the Rosetta Stone or the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're really important. So what was the purpose of the winter count, Keith? And those were usually on hide, right?
Yeah, the ones that we probably become a little more familiar to through seeing them in museums. They're usually typically on a hide, or they could be other fabrics like muslin as well too. But I'm sure there's others too that were probably more earth-based, even more, earlier in time. Like I was saying, they're simply what we call pictographic art or representational type of art, where you're attempting to really show like something recognizable. And so you'll see people maybe or animals, but then some of it also brings in a little bit more like design, which could be stars or circles. But some of that would be like referencing, well, there was a meteor shower, or there was a certain kind of celestial event that was recorded, like a certain kind of solstice or equinox date that was really like important to those people. But the winter count itself is the calendar. That's the best way that we can this make it described as it's simply a calendar, but not in the monthly kind of format that we are used to today. It was winter to winter, so it's a yearly calendar. And so the ones that you would see are talking about years, and they extend to like hundreds of years as well too. And so it was a tradition within the camp that the people would come together and identify like what was the most important event or happening that was their record of that year. And so they would then decide, and then there would be some skilled artisan who would then depict that using maybe earth pigments or different kind of, early media. Later on, after the introduction to things like pencils and paper or paints, then they would probably change media a little bit later too. But they would also talk about, what is it that was always needing to be remembered? What can't be forgotten? Especially if we're like archiving all of this information. What is it that we need to make sure that the future generations can remember? And so you'll see things that kind of seem a little bit like you know, ordinary, maybe. They're not like as spectacular of an event. It could just be that these two different delegates met up from different nations, different indigenous nations. They met up, but they decided to make peace with each other. And actually, that would be symbolic of the Lakota ceremony of making relatives. And so things like that would have a lot more context. And so these are kind of like early versions of like what we might see as media for like film, video, things like that, where we are entertained in a certain way. There's the way that it captivates the imagination, where we follow along with the narrative, the story, but then we also insert ourselves maybe in certain points. And so these would be told, the image would just be like a focal point that supports the actual verbal oral history telling that would then probably occur over the winter times. Winter times are shorter days, and so a lot of the people didn't have much they could do physically. And so they would stay in, and they would try to keep each other entertained maybe. But also there was always these elements of foundation underneath it as well too. Different what we call woksape knowledge, where they were being able to pass that on to the younger listeners so they can't lose sight of that and its purpose for how it's going to help shape them as being productive to their society maybe.
And before we started this call, or the overall Zoom, when we were talking briefly, Keith, I was reminded of something that, again, Paul Chatt-Smith had said. With Western art, the focus in art is the final product, where in American Indian art, the focus is on the process. And I think that the process is what is most curious to many of us, because what is the role of ritual or spirituality in the creation, even for yourself as a Lakota artist? What role does spirituality and ritual and tradition have in the creation of art?
I definitely can't, provide an authoritative answer, but I think what I can start with is some thoughts that I personally have. And I believe this to be pretty pretty common across many Lakota artists I will speak for, and that they will reference that there has to be some sort of a relationship to what becomes transcendent. We can say spiritual as well too, but it's hard to sometimes use that word spirituality or even religion because it might make a listener consider, well, it's very strict and that it requires worship maybe. But I think for many of the common people's perspective of how they have a connection or a relationship with entities of power, creators, it's more so of like a really like it's a little more informal, and it's just it's about having this connection that's based in humility, where they're able to recognize that there's forces greater than themselves, but they're also not going to punish individuals severely if they don't continue to conduct their worship. That's how I can probably explain it. And so for many of the indigenous peoples and Lakota peoples, they know that, they're aware of that, they're made aware of that. There's a belief system early on in life that sticks with them until the end. And they understand that there are just, steps beyond physical life on earth. And so when it comes to creation, it's treated as sacred. It's treated with a respect and regard that it has to have something more so than only the individualistic gain or the selfishness of what we might see as individual within art and artist. Like you're just making art for yourself. And so many of the ancient works of art, they were never really, I think, considered what we call art. They were just things that were made because they were made with the purpose of, I need to help this individual who can't do this, or that I have a skill, I recognize I'm good at doing something. And so I want them to be able to be gifted this. And so it's making things for the people you love, is how I can say it. It's making things for the people you love, and you want them to look their best. You want them to feel like they're cared for, or you want them to actually like be uplifted, empowered, encouraged in life or afterlife as well. Today, today, there's a lot more critical thought because many indigenous peoples have the opportunity to attend universities, academia. They can start to independently learn more about the world through the internet, things like that. Zoom can connect people now where they can be able to experience a different perspective other than their own. And so that broadens the humanities, but it also starts to, I think, help shape the singular perspective of an individual that, okay, well, what is it exactly that I'm doing? or how can I compare what I'm seeing out here through all these different perspectives as what then motivates my perspective to want to make art. And so I think that for many Indigenous peoples, though, they have also been mentally trained to follow the Stoic and Romantic kind of representations out there that have shown Native peoples as being very holistic, being kind of stereotyped that they have like the ability to talk to animals and to do these things that are kind of a little bit abnormal sometimes. And so some of it is a little bit like portrayed in a certain way that it can be confusing, or it can kind of maybe shift a little bit of the authentic spirit. But I think it also could awaken or nourish what's already there naturally, that they just return back to saying, yeah, well, there is something there like spiritually that needs to be a part of my work. It needs to be something where I'm talking about us rather than just me. And so us is another good way too of knowing like maybe it's about their society, their culture, or really maybe it is about their you know, connection to their ancestors as well too. And if they're involving their ancestors, then they're really bringing in like spiritual dimension because these people are gone, so they're only there in spirit. But maybe that's what motivates the artists. Like that's what they want to capture in their work. They're talking about these historical moments like the massacre of Wounded Knee, or even future generations. You know, what are my grandchildren going to see in their time? So they're getting more into like a futuristic kind of way of thinking, but it's still imbued with some sort of essence of spirituality as well too. And I've talked with many artists about this. We've had different discussions, and I love to talk about how artists see this really simply just creation. What does creation mean to us? What does creativity mean to us? And many of them will say, well, it goes back to even our old creation stories about the beginning of time. The eldest of our oral traditions are narratives that talk about a genesis, is maybe how we think about it. But really, it's just the beginning of the universe as we know it. And there's a lot of ways that that's told of in a spiritual kind of like motif. But even also realistically, the dimensions of life, the cycles of birth to death as well too, and how those are understood, sometimes abstract in a way where it's about, you know, you have that same power as a creative. What is it that you're making? Are you treating your creation like you would a child? Are you seeing it into the world like you would your child? You know, how do you then regard that work after it's been created? Do you give it respect? And so certain things were held in a high regard like that, where they were protected, they were cared for, even sometimes fed. There's many indigenous people who, when they make certain objects that we consider art or artifact, they would give an offering of food. They feed it as well too, because they believe that there is a spirit within it as well too. So I
There's
could go on and on, but I won't.
there's a couple of questions in the chat I want to get to. Phyllis asked, what is appropriate when using quilt fabric with a chief and headdress as the focus? Is that something you're familiar with, Keith?
As far as like a pattern, maybe, um, I mean, I don't think that there will be any kind of bad pushback of any artist wanted to create that image, because there's a lot of freedom out there creatively. Anybody can make what they want to make, but if you want it to be sincere, knowing that maybe that ain't part of your culture, then I think that that would be a good way to like ask those that maybe might be able to see it. For us as Lakota people, when there is a headdress being worn, it does signify a really like significant kind of achievement that an individual gained in life. And it's also an artwork itself, you know, having it be created with the feathers of an eagle, reference some of our relatives again, like the Eagle Nations that, you know, have this ability to go far up in the sky to the reaches of the atmosphere. And then they bring that power back. And so to have them in your headdress also shows that you carry that ability as well too. So for some, they'll see it as really like important. And if it's utilized in a way where maybe it's juxtaposed with other kind of imagery or I guess expression, then it might offend some people. But I think that there's this too much freedom today that we can't be too strict. And so again, it's just about the sincerity of the artist, what they choose.
Thank you. Dell asks, do Nakota and Dakota cultural attitudes toward art differ from Lakota?
Definitely. It's because we also have different languages that we describe our experiences in our world differently. We can have some very strong foundations that we can unite on, but they're also in different landscapes. And so they're going to see the world completely different. But they're also, I guess, shaped culturally because of their own different landscapes that we can't expect everyone to say the same thing. But I think there would be a lot more ability to come to like agreement terms than with other tribes like that are even further apart, like the northern plains and the southwest regions will have drastically different viewpoints.
And he wants to know as well, when you were teaching, were you trying to pass on to your students the cultural attitudes about art that you described?
I share my voice, and I encourage them to still have the freedom to think how they want to think. But I definitely will have an enthusiasm behind the way I speak about art, and I'm very passionate about it because I know what has happened in my own life, where it's given me opportunities that are very great. It's also, I would say, saved my life in certain moments. And so I think that there is a way that I've been humbled in my journey, that I know that there are forces behind everything that led me to today that are greater than I am. And when I do follow our lifestyle, our cultural viewpoints, I know that there are sources that are to give credit to for that. And they are majestic and very powerful. So I try not to become like too prescriptive in talking about Lakota art to my Lakota students, especially. But I do encourage them to start to look around and to think more critically for themselves, but also to sometimes simplify their observation and their active listening so that they can find how the world speaks to them and then how they can then understand it on their own terms.
I put in the chat too, Dell, a link to the SDPB video that you did with South Dakota Public Broadcasting. It's called Cultivating Creativity, and you speak to that in that video. So I did put a link to that in the chat and a link to your website as well, because I wanted to turn the focus a little bit to you mentioned Wounded Knee a little while, and I believe you are yourself a descendant of a Wounded Knee survivor. Okay, so that brings to mind the link of how, or not link, but the power of Indigenous art to heal and address generational traumas. So, how would you describe that inherent power of art to heal as a Lakota artist? How help us understand that, if that's even possible?
Okay, I'll speak maybe more broadly to just art overall, how we all might understand that a little bit more uniquely to each of us as listeners.
Okay.
And that art's purpose, no matter which culture today, anyways, I think is about trying to provide a sensational experience. Something is going to activate this way that you feel based off of what you see, hear, taste, feel, or smell, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And either you like or you don't like. If you do like, then you're going to have a different emotion. You're going to start to kind of feel like, well, your question, like, why do I like this? Why is it just like interesting me enough that I'm giving more of my time to it? And so that's what we begin to call aesthetics. There's an aesthetic nature to what kind of then sparks that emotion within each of us. And so I think a lot of then how we would move into like a more kind of profound experience, like this is like amazing, or this has been such a beautiful experience. It's driven me to tears. I actually cry because of this. That's shaped because of the cultural context that was around that person. And I think that that's again why it's important for us to engage with the humanities, because if we are only limited to what we've only ever known as a singular experience our whole life, then we're missing out on those opportunities to maybe like experience something differently for a first time. And you can still make those efforts even if you're very stubborn, maybe, and if you refuse to see a different perspective other than your own, but I think what that will then require is more time. Like you have to commit to trying to open up more communication effort, listen a little bit longer, or look a little bit deeper, or reach a little bit further, maybe, as possibly as well
Right.
too.
So do you feel that that art bridges the gap that sometimes exists between the older and younger generations in the way that the stories are expressed?
Definitely. Yep. It's like I think that art is a good way to visualize what we can consider regeneration.
Okay.
That there is the possibility of time to be cyclical, things come back around again,
Hmm.
breaks us away from only recognizing time as strictly linear. Like there's the past long ago, and it will never be able to reach that again. And all that's, definite is the future that keeps going and going. But for many indigenous peoples, the way that they understand time is cyclical, and that's why you will see circles as very prominent designs across, because it's about the philosophical nature to remind us that we are only a part of a continuum. Things are going to go on almost probably infinitely, but also that we have the ability, if we choose to activate, that we can connect to the past. We can even reach into the future. And so you'll hear many of these certain prophecies become stoic about seeing 7 generations ahead. For the Lakota people, that's what we would speak about. And it's not so much only about like, you have that ability as a psychic to see that far ahead. It's really that you already know what's coming. And so you're making an effort today to meet what's coming into the future as well, too. Or you are recognize a responsibility like your time is now. What are you doing with your time now? Are you prepared to leave whatever you can as an impression for the future? But also another reminder too is to be humbled, that you're not the originator. You're not the only one to maybe come across an idea or a concept, especially in art. And so you got to give some sort of like reference and acknowledgement and be very respectful and give those flowers to those that were in the past. And so you kind of got to get outside of your own bubble sometimes, and you got to deflate an ego to know that how are you a part of a bigger world. And so I use this as a way of speaking only within like the art world, creative world, and that we have many relatives that we owe a lot to. A lot of the contemporary Lakota artists today are using motifs that they borrow or inherit from their ancestors. Many of them acknowledge that very diligently, but many of them also forget about that that's where the source comes from. And even if they're totally abstract and very non-objective, where they just make just lines and colors, paint spills maybe, still that kind of ability to orchestrate that as a composition comes from a source as well too.
So if I could talk to you about this probably for another hour or so, but we got 10 minutes left. So I know that you told us that you're the program manager at Oglala Lakota Art Space. Can you tell us a little bit about that? It's kind of a new thing, right? But it's from what I've read about it, it's incredible.
Yes, so I believe we were the first art space that was developed on a tribal land. And
Mhm.
so the art space is out of the Twin Cities, Minnesota, and they worked in partnership with our organization, which is our parent organization, the First Peoples Fund. And then they're out of Rapid City, South Dakota. And so together they broke ground on this Oglala Lakota art space, which was intended to really service the people, the community of the Oglala Sioux Tribe Pine Ridge Reservation. And so now we've been in operation for about 5 years. And our mainstays, what we really are being recognized now for is that we offer community-led artist workshops. And so we utilize a lot of our teaching instructors from our reservation lands, but also from Rapid City as well too. And they share their gifts for whatever it is that, is their identities creatively. So quill work, beading, sewing, traditional arts, but also fine arts like watercolor or drawing as well too. And so community members are able to attend these workshops at no cost. It's completely free. They just have to register, but even still, people are welcome to walk in if they like, and all supplies are provided. And if they're engaged and then the point that they stay consistently committed, then they can gain these techniques. They can learn these skills for themselves to maybe help themselves with their own livelihoods, or even just carry that on now as a new kind of responsibility in their communities. The other program that's really a main feature of the art space is what we call the Wichak Bioloa music program, which is we have a recording studio there at the building. And so all these artists and creatives who are musically focused, sonically focused, they can come in and record albums. They can record stories. They can, start to think about what it is that their calling is and how they want to share that out there into the world as well too. And so there's many other things that are featured as well too. Like we do host events. We bring in speakers. We bring in different kind of perspectives of conversation, and we welcome any relatives. You don't have to be Oglala citizens to just stop through, or maybe if they start to see what we're really offering, they will make plans to attend more frequently as well too.
Are there programs available for people to participate in creative projects, art making?
Yeah. So I was talking about the workshops, and so we're
How-
going to be
Okay,
rolling out
go ahead.
we're going to be rolling out our next semester. They're kind of like semesters, so we'll start in August with our kind of fall season, and they usually run up until the end of or the beginning of December, and then we'll have a pause, and then we'll start again in the springtime as well too. And then we are working on developing some virtual programs too, which we will invite many speakers to kind of talk about different topics within Lakota arts. So I'll definitely pass that on to you once we have that confirmed.
Okay. So it's open to anybody, like you said, and so we just check out the link that to the Oglala Lakota Art Space, and we'll find out when we could pop in there and take advantage of those workshops.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So I put in I wanted to give a shout out because there right now the 57th annual Red Cloud Indian Art Show is taking place. It's at Mapialuta, Red Cloud School, Heritage, or excuse me, the Heritage Center there. And it's ongoing now, and I think it goes until August 10th. So I'm going to put a link to that in the chat, as well as Julie Garrow from Cheyenne River Youth Project wasn't able to join us. She is actually, I believe, traveling to Washington, D.C. right now with some students who've been invited by the Smithsonian to participate in a folk life creation there. But Red Can Graffiti Invitational Graffiti Jam is also happening in Eagle Butte next week. I went to Eagle Butte last May, I think, first time I'd ever been there. And I went into the gymnasium at the Cheyenne River Youth Project and was completely blown away. I mean, the whole town of Eagle Butte is covered in this phenomenal artwork. And it's graffiti. Technically, it's graffiti, but it's art. And so that's coming up also. And that's in Eagle Butte. It's the 11th annual. The painting, performances, community meals, and youth art activities are July 11th and 12th. So I'm going to put that in the chat. And then there's some also, I think, I want to put some more links to the chat as well, because, if everybody's traveling around, I don't want anybody to miss anything. But is there anything that you want to point out, Keith, that like opportunities that people should be taking advantage of?
When it comes to art, there's plenty of nice hidden treasures in our state of South Dakota. I think everybody might be from South Dakota who's in on this conversation today. And so enjoy finding these hidden treasures. I can point out some in Rapid City. I mean, we have the Doll Art Center, the Sioux Indian Museum, which is part of the Journey Museum. But there's also Racing Magpie, which is really a really empowered new venue, but I say new lightly because they're just now going to be approaching their 10-year anniversary that they've been in existence. So they're really a great location to really look at here in Western South Dakota, Rapid City. There's of course the Heritage Center, Makpia Luta down there at Red Cloud School. I know that Red Cloud Art Show is one of the longest, it is the longest running art show on a reservation. And so there's such a great just variety of work when you go down that way and see it. There's the art space out in our area as well too, but even as you move further east, I mean, Akdal Lakota Museum is a great stop in Chamberlain. If you can make it to Sioux Falls, then there's the Washington Pavilion, and there's other kind of galleries like Jennifer White's Post Pilgrim. She's really pushing like a new contemporary opportunity to see art that's more modern. And then if you can go up further north, I mean, there's South Dakota Art Museum in Brookings. They always have such wonderful exhibits. It's one of my favorite museums in the state. You know, of course, there's Aberdeen, there's Mitchell, there's Vermilion. Like I keep going all across, you know, and then even smaller areas, like more rural, they have their own little nuggets of, you know, what they're doing. Maybe there's public art, maybe there's a festival or some sort of a gathering taking place. So you kind of have to get out sometimes and just like experience it and kind of go with the flow and like welcome the unpredictable sometimes.
Yeah.
We're also now in a time too where you will be seeing a lot more of the powwow wachipi season. And so if you want to see some of the indigenous kind of native nations culture, I mean, go and visit these areas, you know, see what it's like, because a lot of it is going to be visual. You can either see the dancers, you get to hear the music, but you can also see the people and how they are just like together. You know, what is that experience like as well too? And then there is further out the Black Hills powwow, which is a big one for South Dakota too, and that's in October here in Rapid City. And so if you've never attended that, I would highly like recommend you try to make it out. It's on a weekend, see what that's like for yourself. And I think that people will really be satisfied to come in and encounter what that experience could be like.
Yeah, I think it's like my big goal is to get to Acta, Lakota, and Chamberlain because I'm a huge fan of Arthur Amiot's collages. I think they're amazing. I would just want to see one in person, and I'm of course a huge fan of Don Montelo, and his work is there too. So that's one of the places I absolutely have on the map for myself. So there's just so much to see, and it like you could I think from what I've been reading and the things I've seen, you could literally just put a summer art tour together and just travel around South Dakota and see so many amazing American Indian art pieces. And like my trip to the museum in Washington D.C. really kind of got me fired up for that. So I really want to try to give that a shot too. We're right up on the 1 o'clock hour, so I do want to take some time to thank everybody. Thank you, Keith, for being here. I'm sorry that there are other guests were unable to make it, but you have enlightened us tremendously. I appreciate your work. I encourage everyone to take a look at Keith's website and the work that he's done there. And if you're available, I invite you to join us on the 17th. We're going to speak with David Adler. He's a constitutional law expert, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about what's going on and kind of put things into perspective for us. So it's going to be a kind of a 180 from what we're talking about today, but we'll still find good things to talk about. So thanks everybody for joining us. Enjoy your holiday tomorrow. Hopefully it's not too hot for everybody, but what do you do? And thanks for joining us. Thank you, Keith. Everybody have a wonderful time.
Thanks, Keith.
Bye-bye.